So this video is kind of a bit different to what I usually do, but today I'm going to tell you a bit about the history of the 1960s counterculture. I've always been super interested in history, and a lot of you have been reaching out to me kind of asking where I get all of the information from, and I personally just love to read about the 60s and 70s. I personally believe to understand the music, the fashion, the makeup, and the spirit of the 60s and 70s, you kind of have to get into the history to understand in which context 60s and 70s art happened. So today I decided to film a video all about explaining the 60s counterculture to you. So while planning this video, I wrote down some notes, that's why I'm gonna look into this book. And also please note that I'm just gonna touch on a few topics because the 60s and 70s were a really interesting and big time period, and it's kind of hard to break it down, but I just try to focus on some major aspects of the time. However, I would love to maybe turn this into a little series where maybe I'll pick some different subcultures like the beatniks, the mods, or talk about some different groups like the Merry Pranksters, some major happenings like Woodstock, and just put these into little separate videos. But today is just kind of an overview of the time period. So I would like to start by explaining to you what counterculture actually means. And I think the best way to explain it is by reading a quote to you said by Lisa Law. If you don't know who Lisa Law is, she's basically a filmmaker and photographer. She took a lot of footage and pictures of really important people of the counterculture and the 60s, such as Bob Dylan. She was also present at Woodstock, and there's a quote from her where she kind of tries to explain the whole counterculture, and I'm just gonna read that to you because I feel like it captures the time spirit really well. The counterculture was an attempt to rebel against the values our parents had pushed on us. We were trying to get back to loving and relating and living. So just like the term counterculture kind of indicates, it's a culture mainly going against something. And basically a big part of the 60s and the counterculture was to revolt against the political and social situation. So even though the counterculture kind of emerged at different places in the early 60s, San Francisco and especially Haight-Ashbury was kind of the place to be. So to kind of understand the counterculture and what they were going against, I would like to tell you a bit about the political situation of the 60s. So basically in the 60s, the Cold War had reached its climax with the Cuban crisis, and the world was on the verge of a nuclear war. Like pretty much any coming-of-age generation, the young people of the 60s started questioning the values and norms of the dominant culture. Groups like African Americans, environmentalists, women, and gays and lesbians started demanding their rights and wanted to create a more inclusive society. A lot of the protests actually started at universities because that was basically where a lot of young and educated people were, and that is where they started questioning the society and in what kind of world they wanted to live. So just like any other culture, you can't really nail down where it started, when it started, or who it started, and the counterculture in general was basically a mixture of a lot of different people going against a lot of different issues of the time. It was really a mixture of people, ideas, events, circumstances, and technological development, which made for an exceptionally rapid change. So as said before, just like with any other culture, you can't really say that was the day, that was the time, and these people were there when counterculture was born, but there were some events leading up to it, and we're gonna take a closer look at these events now. So one of the most important events for the counterculture, and kind of the moment where the counterculture really took off, was the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of 1963. So Kennedy campaigned for civil rights and against discrimination, which made him pretty popular among younger people. So many younger US citizens kind of saw him as the last straw, and with his death, a lot of young people saw their political ideas as lost. Another major event of the 60s was the Vietnam War. So Vietnam was divided in 1954 into communist North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So North Vietnam wanted to control South Vietnam again, and basically the whole war was really important because it really was the system of communism going against the system of capitalism. So later on, the UDSSR started supporting the North Vietnamese, while the US started supporting South Vietnam. So the US started supplying South Vietnam with napalm. If you don't know what napalm is, it is basically a highly explosive firearm, which they threw out of planes on villages that were controlled by the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong was basically a communist group in southern Vietnam. I'm gonna put up a picture here that is super popular for the time, and in that picture you see a naked girl running away from the napalm smoke clouds after her village was bombed. So starting in 1964, the US Army started sending ground troops to South Vietnam in their fight against the Viet Cong, while China and the UDSSR started supporting North Vietnam. So basically what happened was a classic proxy war. And a proxy war is when basically two countries aren't fighting against each other directly, but by taking their war to another country. So what really happened here was the big Cold War of the 60s, which was basically all about communism versus capitalism, with the US and a lot of Western countries supporting capitalism and a lot of Eastern countries, and especially the UdSSR, supporting communism. And they took that war out in Vietnam. So there were two major things that kind of made this war different to any other war that there has been before. First of all, the amount of civilians and children that died in that war is extremely high. And the second big difference was how graphic that war was. So basically there were always cameras around. There were tons of pictures and footage coming from Vietnam, and by the mid-60s pretty much any household in the US had a TV. So pretty much any household knew very graphically and very detailed what was going on in Vietnam. So essentially a big part of counterculture was anti-war culture. And that was also mainly driven by the fact that many young men were convened by the army and brought to Vietnam to fight. So essentially hippie culture grew out of a drive for peace. A big part of hippie and counterculture in general was the idea of changing society by withdrawing from it. So basically hippies criticized the establishment by simply not being part of society. And basically anything that was different from social standards, such as living in a commune, were welcomed. A big influence on hippie culture was actually the Beat generation. The Beat generation was active in the 50s, and they basically refused materialism, and they were all for sexual freedom and mind-expanding substances. So the beatniks often wore dark turtlenecks and dark sunglasses, and a lot of them were actually artists and musicians such as Chet Baker. So similar to the start of counterculture in the Western countries, it developed in the Eastern countries, mainly driven by young people not being happy with the establishment and being frustrated with the system. In cities like Moscow and Kiev, led by the phrase "make love not war," counterculture definitely had its place in the 60s. A lot of young people started refusing army services, and with the Prague Spring a slow change came to the Soviet Union. That change was also fed by the fact that the country was facing an economic crisis. The young generation criticized the low standards of living, and artists and intellectuals started protesting against the censorship. However, other countries of the Warsaw Pact didn't really like to see the change happening in Czechoslovakia, and Russian troops stormed the country with almost 100 people dying in the protests. So when we take a look at counterculture and music and art of the 60s, they kind of go hand in hand. The counterculture inspired a lot of musicians and artists at the time, and the art that they performed inspired the counterculture to grow. There were a lot of artists who addressed the political and social situation in their songs and arts, with some of the most famous ones being Janis Joplin, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, or the Grateful Dead. These artists communicated their thoughts through their music, and because their music was so popular, it really drew a lot of people into the counterculture. So in the 60s, peace gatherings were extremely popular. Basically, hippies and people who shared the idea of the counterculture would meet up, make music, make art, and just enjoy having a good time with each other. But these gatherings weren't just for music, art, and fun, but there was basically a huge political idea standing behind it, and that was the idea of changing the societies and making love not war. So two of the most popular peace gatherings were the Summer of Love in 1967 in San Francisco and the famous Woodstock Festival in 1969. With the Woodstock Festival arguably being the epitome of the 60s counterculture, both of these events weren't only focused on the art but also on the political issues of the time. Another big moment for the counterculture was when President Nixon re-signed on August 9th in 1974. That was a result of the Watergate scandal, which basically was a chain of scandals coming to light in which the government around Nixon had abused their governmental powers. So by the mid-70s, counterculture had kind of lost its momentum, and that was mainly due to the fact that most of the people who were very vocal and loud and important for the counterculture in the 60s were college students at that time, and these people had now grown up and a lot of them started working and fitting in with the society. Another big change was that things had become a lot more liberal than they were in the mid-60s, so there wasn't really a need anymore to push as hard against the government and the system as there was in the 60s. So even though the counterculture kind of just took place between the late 60s and the mid-70s, it is still extremely relevant today, and I kind of feel like it is still happening in our culture, or to be more precise, outside of our culture. So a lot of the things the counterculture was revolting against are still issues today, such as women's rights, LGBTQ+ plus rights, racism, animal rights, and just a general idea of making love and not war. I feel like with everything that happened in the past year, you can really see that there are still so many issues in today's society, especially talking about racism, talking about inequality, or environmental issues. I feel like a lot of the issues that were really important back then are still important up until today. And I think that is why, even though counterculture kind of lost its momentum in the early 70s, it is still extremely popular. Obviously, another big factor here is that the music and the art of the time are still super popular. A lot of the people refer to the 60s and the 70s as the golden era of rock music and of free living and art, and I feel like that is a desire a lot of people still have in them. The desire of living a free life and being who you are and not having to fit in with any social standard. So I personally consider myself as a hippie because these are some values that I just stand for and that I think are really important in today's culture, and I feel like the community kind of grows every single day because I feel like it's the change that our society needs. So that kind of wraps up today's video. As said before, I didn't really go into detail in every single way because I just feel like this video would be a 2-hour-long history class, which I would love to do, but I just kind of feel like it is easier to break it into parts. So I kind of want to turn this into a series and share my love for history with you, with kind of taking a closer look at certain events, people, and political ideas of the 60s and 70s. So please feel free to leave a comment down below if there's any topic that you would like me to talk about. It could be something like the beat culture, or the Merry Pranksters, or the Woodstock Festival, or Haight-Ashbury. Whatever you're interested in, just leave a comment down below because, as said before, I'm a bit of a history nerd and I would love to share my love for history and the time period with you. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would mean a lot. If you're new to the channel, hi, my name is Emma. It's kind of weird to introduce myself at the end, but I just kind of feel like if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy learning about the 60s and 70s, about the culture, the music, and the fashion and the makeup, then I would love you to subscribe to this channel because I upload multiple videos every single week all about that. I hope you're having an amazing day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine, take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye guys!